Welcome everyone. My name is Christoph Dressler. I'm the director for Go Learn at the University of Utah. Sam and many other of our faculties are taking us on trips. In this case for Sam, it goes to, as you can see on your screen, we go to Sweden in June. And we are running a faculty-led travel programs all over the world. We are locked up like everyone else. We don't go. So today we're bringing the road to you in your living room, and Sam will present today on the Eastern Vikings, the Hanseatic League, and Ingmar Bergman. Sounds like a potpourri, but I think it has a lot of purpose. And I'm really excited every time we're going back to Europe and to the, in this case, 9th century. There's always so much to learn because when we think of Europe, we're thinking of this concept today. But boy, you know, as you all know, the Vikings have shaken up the Europe back then. So without much further ado, I will get out of the picture, but I will collect all the questions and answers in the background. And at the end of this, in about an hour or 45 minutes, we will get to those questions. So thank you everyone for joining us. And Sam, thank you for your presentation today. Thanks for taking us to Sweden, the Vikings, the Hanseatic League, and Ingmar Bergman.
All right. Well, folks, let's get to it. We've got a lot to cover here in the next 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have some Q&A afterwards. Well, let's just start out. I'll be talking about the Eastern Vikings as opposed to the Western Vikings, also the Hansa or Hanseatic League and Ingmar Bergman, and believe it or not, they mesh. First off, I'll talk about the Eastern Vikings, who were primarily Svear, or Swedish tribes, and Gotlanders, who, unlike their western-ranging Danish and Norwegian cousins, ranged eastward and southeastward. Then I'll talk about the German-based Hanseatic League, Die Hansa in German, of the late Middle Ages and early modern periods. And I'll address Die Hansa's trading and military activities in the Baltic and North Atlantic. And finally, I'll talk about the Swedish master filmmaker Ingmar Bergman. Now, it's Bergman, which means mountain man, although English speakers typically call him Bergman. Well, it's Bergman. I'll be saying Bergman, so you know who I'm talking about here. Bergman, Die Hansa, and the Eastern Vikings do meet on a few points, as you will see. Next slide. First, a little Swedish. I hope that you find my presentation, as the Swedes say, lagom, meaning not too much, not too little, just right. Lagom. But first, a little Swedish lesson. There's a lot to learn in Swedish, but here's a little slice. Swedish has some sounds that we don't find in the English language. And here's one of the sounds that are rather special. The SJ, the STJ, and the SKJ, and also the SK, but before the vowels, the soft vowels, E, I, Y, E, and Ö. The sound is close to the English whew, but not exactly. So let's do a few examples here. First, SJU, whew. Not quite whew, but whew. It means 7. Stjärna, star. Skjorta, shirt. And skina, to shine. And then, of course, there's that UN Attorney General who went down in a plane crash in 1969. His name was Dag Hammarskjöld. Now you know how to say it. Well, here's yours truly. The so-called Viking Age spans the years 793 in the Christian era to 1066, when the Norman, or Northmen, descendant of Danish Vikings, William, beat the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson's army at Hastings. Between 793 and 1066, Vikings made their mark, you could say. And as you see here, literally, they made their mark on this runestone. Now, again, that's yours truly, and this particular runestone stands in Lund, Sweden, not far from the University of Lund, and Lund's massive medieval Romanesque cathedral. In Old Norse, the runic inscription here reads, I'll say it in Old Norse, Sven och Thorjöter gerthu kumbel vessi efter manna och svena. Gud hjälpe sköl vera well, and there ligger I Lundunum. In English, that's Sven and Torjot made these memorials after Mana and Svena. God help their soul well, and they lie in London. Now, my favorite current Viking television series, hands down, is Netflix series The Last Kingdom. Now, this isn't a slide from The Last Kingdom. There's The Last Kingdom slide. Now, The Last Kingdom's based on British historical novelist Bernard Cornwell's The Saxon Stories series. The series' main character, the Anglo-Saxon Uhtred, whose name in Old English means Twilight Counselor, was raised by Danish Vikings. Despite the fact that Uhtred is a wholly fictional character, Cornwell's novels hew closely to the historical record. Let's go back to the Vikings series. I'm not so charitable when it comes to this series. On Amazon Prime is the History Channel's produced Vikings series. And while I enjoy this series, its regular veering from history really vexes me. It's not what I expect from the History Channel. Both Vikings and The Last Kingdom focus on the Western Viking story, which first appears on the radar with the Danish attack on the Northumbrian island of Lindisfarne. And here's a picture, a photograph of Lindisfarne, also known as the Holy Island, which I took a few years ago from the Northumbrian shoreline about 50 miles southwest of Edinburgh, Scotland. There's the island itself. Now, the 793 sacking of Lindisfarne sent shockwaves throughout Western Europe. In the wake of the attack, the scholar and monk Elquin of York described Lindisfarne as the most venerable site in all of Britain. Never before, Elquin wrote, has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Elquin goes on, the heathens, he wrote, pour out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. The later Latin quote, a furore Normanorum libera nos Domine, from the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, Lord, is apocryphal, but it expresses Western European fear of Viking attack. While the forays of the Western Vikings by Danes and Norwegians, now the map here shows you their travels here in red. Anyway, while their forays get most of the press, these Western Vikings, the story of the Eastern Vikings, that's over here, the dark arrows. Okay, the stories of the Eastern Vikings, Svear or Swedish tribals, as well as Gotlanders, is also significant. Unlike the Rollos and the Ragnar Lothbrok, warriors of the Western Vikings, less is known of the figureheads of the Eastern Vikings, who tended to be traders and adventurers rather than marauders. Their main routes east, again over here, into what's present-day Russia and the Ukraine. Okay. Well, they're traced with the arrows. Let me get back on track here. Okay, next slide. There we go. We know relatively little about the Eastern Viking Rurik, but that doesn't mean that Rurik isn't a legendary figure among present-day Russians. We do know that Rurik was a Varangian chieftain, Varangian being a Greek term for the Rus, Scandinavian peoples at the time in the broad region stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. We know that Rurik was a mid-9th century leader in the Viking settlements at Lake Ladoga, up here. And Novgorod, to the south of Lake Ladoga. It's the Old Norse Nigarthur, it's what the Old Norse called it, which in Russian is Novgorod, means the same thing. In any case, some see Rurik the Rus Viking as one of Russia's founding fathers, as you might gather from the photograph of a monument in the present-day Russian city of Novgorod. Okay, we'll just go back to that. This city is considered to be one of the cradles of the Russian nation. Some argue, probably incorrectly, that the very name Russia itself stems from the Rus Vikings associated with Rurik and Novgorod. This is Oleg of Novgorod, another legendary Viking figure in Russian history. He was also known as Oleg the Prophet. Oleg was a relative of Rurik, and he ruled the Rus Vikings as a konung, or king, in the decades after Rurik's death. Oleg figures in the rise of the city of Kiev in the Ukraine, which is widely seen also as a cradle of what became later Russia. Season 6 of the Viking TV series features a highly fictionalized Oleg. In red, on this map, are the key sea and river routes of the Eastern Vikings, which reached to the Caspian and the Black Seas. Byzantium, also known as Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, or as the East Vikings called it, Miklagarður, the Great Yard, was a prime Viking destination. And many an East Viking served in the Byzantine Emperor's elite Varangian Guard from the 10th to the 14th centuries. To finish today's look at the East Vikings, let's go to the Volga River, which drains into the Caspian Sea over here. In 921, the Abbasid Caliphate sent Ahmed ibn Fadlan as part of a diplomatic mission to the king of the Volga Bulgars. Ibn Fadlan was an expert in Islamic law and faith. Ibn Fadlan wrote an account of his travels that includes his encounter with the funeral of an East Viking chieftain. I was told, wrote Fadlan, that when their chieftains die, the least they do is to cremate them. I was very keen to verify this, and by luck, I learned of the death of one of their great men. The Vikings had placed him in his grave and set a canopy over it, and they left him there for 10 days until they had finished sewing his funeral garments. In the case of a poor man, the Vikings built a small boat, place him inside it, and burn it. In the case of a rich man, they gather together his possessions and divide them into 3, 1/3 for his family, 1/3 to pay for his funeral garments, and 1/3 to buy alcohol, which they drink on the day when his slave girl is killed and cremated together with her master. One girl volunteered to die in the particular funeral spectacle Fadlan witnessed. Of her, he wrote, "Every day the slave girl would drink alcohol and would sing merrily and cheerfully. On the day of the chieftain's cremation, Fadlan wrote that he came to the river where the dead Viking ship had been beached and hauled onto a scaffold. The mourners advanced, circling the boat and uttering words which I did not understand. Then they placed a bench on the ship and brought quilts and cushions of Byzantine silk brocade, and then a crone, whom they called the Angel of Death, draped the quilts over the bench and set the cushions upon it. She is responsible for having the dead man's funeral garments sewn up and for putting his body in order, and it is she who killed the slave girl. I myself saw her, a gloomy, corpulent woman, neither old or young. They fetched the chieftain's body, which, Ibn Fadlan wrote, hadn't begun to stink. That's after 10 days, but which by then had turned black. And they also took the alcohol, the fruit, and the lyre, kind of a stringed instrument, they had buried with them. They dressed the body in trousers, leggings, boots, and a silk kaftan with gold buttons, and they placed on his head a silk hat with fringes of sable fur. You can see that in the picture, upper left side. They propped up the dead Viking on the quilted and cushioned bench, and they set alcohol, fruit, herbs, bread, meat, and onions next to him. They chopped a dog in two and threw it onto the ship. They placed the dead man's weapons next to him. Then they made 2 horses gallop until the beast frothed with sweat, and then they cut them up and set the flesh on the ship. They also slaughtered a cow, a rooster, a hen, and they flung these dead animals on board. Meanwhile, Fadlan wrote, the slave girl who wished to be killed was coming and going, entering one tent after another. The owner of each tent would have sex with her and say to her, "Tell your master that I have done this purely out of love for him." At the evening prayer on Friday, they brought the slave girl to a door frame-like structure they had built. She stood on the turned up palms of the men who raised her above that door frame. She said something, and then they brought her down. They lifted her up a second time, and she did what she had done the first time. They brought her down and then lifted her up a third time, and she did what she had done on the first 2 occasions. Next, they handed her a hen. She cut off its head and threw it away. They took the rest of the hen and tossed it on board the ship. I asked the interpreter about her actions, and he said, the first time they lifted her, she said, "Behold, I see my father and my mother." The second time, she said, "Behold, I see all of my dead kindred." The third time, she said, "Behold, I see my master seated in paradise. Paradise is beautiful and green. He is with his men and his male servants. He summons me, so bring me to him." The girl, Fadlan wrote, then took off her bracelets and anklets and gave them to the angel of death and her daughters. The girl drank alcohol and chanted. The interpreter told me that this is how she bids farewell to her female companions. She took another drink, and then the angel of death dragged her by the head to the dead chieftain. The men banged their shields so other slave girls couldn't hear her screams, which might have made them later not volunteer to die with their masters. 6 men had sex with the slave girl. Then they and the angel of death killed her. Fadlan wrote, then the dead girl's male next of kin set a piece of wood ablaze. He was completely naked. He walked backwards toward the ship, his face to the people, with the burning wood in one hand and his other hand cupped over his rear end. He ignited the firewood that had been placed under the ship. Then the people came forward, each carrying a blazing stick, which was tossed into the quickly growing fire, which soon consumed the ship, the man, the slave girl, and everything. A dreadful wind arose, and the flames leapt higher and blazed fiercely. What an account of a Viking funeral. They then built an earthen mound over the burned vessel. When a Viking king died, Fadlan wrote, 400 men and 40 slave girls died with them. The writer, Michael Crichton, cribs Ibn Fadlan's account of the East Vikings in his 1976 novel, Eaters of the Dead. Not to mention that Crichton also cribs liberally from the poem Beowulf. Crichton's novel was adapted to the screen in 1999's The 13th Warrior, starring Antonio Banderas as Ibn Fadlan. Well, let's move on to the Hanseatic League. Give me just a minute here. In many ways, the German-based Hanseatic League, or Die Hansa, in German, meaning the convoy, succeeded the traders of the Viking Age in the Baltic and North Atlantic. From its beginnings in the late 12th century, Die Hansa dominated Northern European sea, river, and overland commerce for over 300 years. This map shows the Hanseatic League's reach and its key ports. For example, in the Baltic region, Riga, which is in Latvia, Königsberg, Danzig, Visby on Gotland, and Stockholm. Novgorod in Russia. Actually, Novgorod is much too far to the east to appear on this particular map. And Hamburg and Bremen in northern Germany. Copenhagen in Denmark. Bergen in Norway. Bruges in West Flanders. And London and many other cities in Britain and many other cities in Northern Europe. In our day, the German airline Lufthansa recalls the old Hansa. It is, you might say, a convoy in the air. And by the way, there are two fine museums in Europe dedicated to the history of the Hanseatic League. One in the northern city of Lübeck and another in Bergen in Norway. So this is a picture I took in 1984, actually, in Bergen. Just looking across from where I was staying. It was a bed and breakfast kind of place, and there it was. You see these, the string of buildings, they're all Hansa warehouses. Of course, they're not used for that today. They are restaurants and shops and such. The actual museum for the Hansa League isn't one of these buildings. It's slightly elsewhere. It doesn't look quite like these. And then, of course, the sailing ship in front of them at the wharf here in Bergen is not of the Hansa period. It looks 19th, 20th century kind of ship. But anyway, this is Bergen, and again, it was a Hansa affiliated port in the age of the Hanseatic League. Now, this gets back to what Hansa ports actually looked like in the day, this woodcut. Okay. These are 15th century sailing ships. They're trading vessels. I'm not sure which Hanseatic port this is. I think it is somewhere in Poland, maybe. But you can see that the port is a very busy one. And you can see here at the bottom center of the frame, you have traders, and they're dealing in cloths, I don't know, silks or whatever. Looks very precious, expensive vessels. You can see traders loading wares onto carts and unloading ships and such. Anyway, a Hansa port would have looked like this around 1500 or so. All right. Well, here I am in front of a Hansa-era building in Bruges in Flemish Belgium. And I want you to notice one thing. In back of me, we have brick construction. It's very, very thick and massive. It's typical of what's called the brick Gothic style of the old Hanseatic cities. A lot of places they built in red brick or brown brick, kind of depended on where you were. And again, there was a lot of mass to these buildings, and you typically see them from Flanders. Even in England, you see them, particularly in Denmark. There are many, many through the Baltic states, all the way into Western Russia. You see this style, and it dates back to the Viking Age, or not the Viking Age, the Hansa Age, excuse me. Okay. Now, the city of Lübeck, let's go there. The city of Lübeck in northern Germany, it's just south of Denmark. It dominated Die Hansa. It led the way, you might say. This etching shows the city's many wharves, its defensive walls. You had to protect the product that you were trying to sell and transport. You see its architecture, and you probably noticed all the wealth that's involved. The Hanseatic League was a great way to make money, and it did, for sure. And it's evidenced in its architecture and the wealth of its cities in Northern Europe. Now here's a picture that I took. This was, I think, in 1985. I was in Lübeck. Actually, I was studying German at the university in Kiel and would go up to Lübeck and Copenhagen. This here you see on the left, it's one of the western city gate of medieval Lübeck, Hansa-era Lübeck. It's called the Holsten Tor, or the Holstein Gate, and it was built in 1464. Now, I want you to look to its right. You see a cathedral with a high spire. It's a brick cathedral, but here in the right center, what you're looking at, you see old Hansa warehouses. And again, they're built in brick, and they date, again, from the Hansa era. They were used as warehouses. There's actually some water. There's a little channel that goes up right in front of them. It's hidden by the hedge that you see there. Now, this makes me happy to look at these warehouses. One of the reasons is I'm a film buff, and Northern European film in particular. One of my favorite movies of all time is F.W. Murnau's great vampire film, Nosferatu. Now, these warehouses you see, center frame here, a little bit left, outside the window, where the sun has risen. The vampire, played by Max Schreck, a German actor who took that name, Max Schreck, as a stage name. The name means maximum fear. Great name, great stage name. Anyway, Maximum Fear has just attacked Mina, the heroine of the story. And unfortunately, she's kept him by her bed a little bit too long, and the sun has come up. And this is the way the vampire is destroyed in Nosferatu. It's the sunlight. He got a little too greedy and stuck around too long. So here come the rays of the rising sun. You see them coming up over the Hansa warehouses that you just saw in the previous picture, and they hit him. And of course, he vanishes in a puff of smoke. Great scene. This is my favorite vampire movie of all time, by the way. Nosferatu, F.W. Murnau. Well, let's move a few hundred miles northeast of Lübeck to the southeastern Swedish coast. Visby, see here, you can see my cursor. On the Isle of Gotland, the Swedes would say Gotland, had been the most prominent trading city in the Baltic during the Viking period. In the Hansa period, Visby remained an important center. I got my notes out of order here. Let me find where I am. Anyway, Visby remained a very important seaport, and it was affiliated oftentimes with the Hansa League. Trading cities, such as Visby, needed protection. Protection from pirates and from other threats. So, southwest of Visby, on the Swedish mainland, you see way down at the bottom of the frame left, the city of Kalmar today, a castle was built. Kalmar Castle. And here's a picture of it. Again, a massive brick castle, and it's been adorned with Baroque features since it was originally built, but it's still there today. It's a World Historical Site and well worth seeing. It was built to protect the Hansa trading lanes, especially the ones that went north to Visby and ultimately to Stockholm. Okay. This is a current picture of Visby itself. And you can see here the massive walls that protected the Hansa trading city. You can see Hansa-era warehouses here and a Hansa-era church. Again, everything's built in brick. It's a beautiful city, and it's a city that we will visit in Go Learn's 2021 Swedish adventure. So welcome to come along with that. Hope to see you, actually. Okay, Visby has an interesting history and some interesting stories in the Hansa period, and we're going to go to one I'm going to focus on for just a minute here. It's the sacking of Visby by the Danish king Valdemar IV, who was also known as Valdemar Atterdag. You can see him. He's enthroned here in the city of Visby. He's just attacked the city and overrun it. And anyway, there's an interesting story about this. In 1361, he had overrun the city of Visby. And tradition, this painting by the Swedish painter Carl Gustav Hellquist, illustrates what might be more tradition and legend than what actually happened, but it depicts the attack and the conquest of Visby by the Danish king Atterdag, and Hansa trading issues had a lot to do with his motivations for attacking the city, actually. But the legend holds that Atterdag held the city of Visby ransom, you might say. This is called his brandskattning, or his fire tax. Unless the good people of Visby fill 3 very sizable gold beer vats, they have to fill it with gold, silver, and jewels and that sort of thing. What he's going to do is burn the whole city down. Well, he didn't burn the whole city down, but there was a big battle there, and he did conquer it briefly, and then the Swedes got it back later. It's a long story. So it didn't get burned to the ground, thank goodness, but there was a lot of damage done. But enough of the Danish king, Valdemar Atterdag. The Danes now are long gone, and Visby, of course, has been a Swedish city for a long, long time, as it was before Atterdag came. What I want to do now is move north to the Swedish capital, the Venice of the north, Stockholm. You can see Gotland here, and we go north, top of the frame, you see the Stockholm area. Stockholm sits in an archipelago that becomes an inland lake called Mälaren. And it was the old ancestral home of the Svear tribes. Svear is the Swedish name for the tribes that lived in the area. The name Sweden actually comes from the term Svear. The Swedish name for its country is Sverige, not Sweden, Sverige, which means the Reich or kingdom of the Svear. So, Stockholm. Let's talk about Stockholm. Here's Stockholm in the Hansa era. During the Viking period, Stockholm had been insignificant. The key cities in the area had been Svear centers, Hälje, for instance, Birka, Sigtuna, and Old Uppsala. In the Hanseatic era, Stockholm rose to prominence and dominated the region. So it was the Hansa that made Stockholm really what it is today. Here's a photo. Okay, this is Stockholm's Gamla stan, or Old City, with its Hansa-era buildings. During much of GoLearn's 2021 Summer Sweden adventure, we'll be staying in Gamla stan, quite close to the square that you see in the picture. Now you recognize this fellow, Max von Sydow. Max von Sydow died just a month or so ago. I was very sad. One of my favorite actors of all time. And here you see Max von Sydow playing Father Maron in the 1974 film, The Exorcist. You might have seen the film, you probably have. I mean, he's getting ready to tell the devil who's possessed the girl Reagan, the power of Christ compels you. All that, we all remember that. Well, von Sydow was in a lot of films, in Sweden, in Europe, and he did many Hollywood films, including Star Wars. He was in several of the Star Wars films as well. Now, I want you to note his German surname, von Sydow. Von Sydow. Now, he is 100% Swedish for sure, but his name is a relic of the Hansa Age, when German trade interests dominated. Most Northern European cities had a German district. So his name is, again, from ultimately Germans, that family name. Here's another shot of Max von Sydow, much younger. This is from 1956. The thoroughly Swedish but German name Max von Sydow rose to international fame through his work with the Swedish master of cinema, Ingmar Bergman. Again, it's Bergman, not Bergman. Here's Ingmar Bergman with another Swedish master of cinema, Victor Sjöström. Now there's that Swedish SJ sound again, Sjö, who during his Hollywood career at MGM in the 1920s went by Victor Seaström. Seaström, working for MGM, directed some of the great silent films of the Hollywood era. The Wind, for instance, The Scarlet Letter, He Who Laughs, and quite a few others. He spent a decade in Hollywood, but then returned to Sweden, where he continued to direct and also became a very prominent actor. Now, again, here is Victor Seaström, or Sjöström, and the young Bergman. This is 1957, on the set of Bergman's classic art film, Wild Strawberries. And he's hired Seaström, one of his idols, to play the main role in the film. By the way, Max von Sydow has a small part in Wild Strawberries as well. Okay. It was Wild Strawberries and Bergman's previous masterpiece, 1956's The Seventh Seal, starring Max von Sydow as the knight who famously plays chess with death. That, along with the 1950s films, of the European masters Federico Fellini and Robert Bresson, set the international art film movement in motion. There's our own Tower Theater. And if we have art films, such as Bergman films or Fellini films, as opposed to the commercial Hollywood-type films we're used to, we must have art film houses in which to screen them. So in the late 50s and 60s, we start seeing art houses along with traditional studio film theaters. These art houses have names such as the New Art, that's in West Los Angeles, the Blue Mouse, who remembers the Blue Mouse, Salt Lake City, and of course our beloved Tower Theater. Here's a still from Wild Strawberries. You see Victor Seaström playing Isak Borg, the protagonist of the film. You see his reflection, facial reflection, in the mirror held by Bibi Andersson. Of course, she's holding the mirror up to Isak. The movie is about self and selfhood, and the meaning of life. Who am I, in particular? Now, Bergman wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a writer and a prominent director of theater as well. A few years back, I was walking down the street in the southwestern Swedish city of Helsingborg. I looked up and lo and behold, right there was young Ingmar Bergman looking down at me. One of Bergman's first jobs was as the director of Helsingborg's City Theater. Bergman also directed operas. He was very interested in classical music and opera. And in 1975, he adapted Mozart's The Magic Flute to the screen. And here's a trade still for the movie. Bergman shot The Magic Flute in a studio reconstruction of the 18th century Baroque theater in the Swedish royal castle Drottningholm, which is just west of Stockholm. Our Go Learn trip, 2021, includes a tour of Drottningholm and its famed Baroque theater. Let's go back to Gotland, though. It ties into Bergman. Bergman was born far to the north of Stockholm, in Uppsala, the old Viking city. And he was raised primarily in Stockholm. He rose to fame as a film director in Stockholm. But in the 1960s, once he was rich and famous, he took up residence on Fårö. You can see it up here if you can check out my cursor. Fårö. It means the far island. Ö is island in Swedish. Took up residence here, about here on the island. On Fårö, Bergman made many of his art house masterpieces of the middle 1960s, well, actually all the 1960s and some of the 1970s, of which 1966's Persona is the most famous and influential. Here we see Bergman regulars, Bibi Andersson and Liv Ullmann, on Fårö, and they're going through Bergman's script for Persona. Here's an image from that film. Great film, very, very innovative, very much an art film. Wonderful film, black and white. Now ends our exploration of Bergman, or Bergman, the Hanseatic League, and the East Vikings on a happy image, which of course is the famous Dance of Death shot that closes Bergman's The Seventh Seal. I hope that my presentation has been lagom, not too much, not too little, just right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I learned a few new things, and I have to confess, I really just had to Wikipedia myself into some knowledge on Bergman before this panel. I think part of the reason why he also went to Fårö, he had some sort of scandal with finances.
Yeah, it was before this actually. That was 1976, and the Swedish tax Nazis. Back then, you paid about 90% tax to the state. Anyway, turned out to be a spurious charge, probably politically oriented, but he was arrested. And actually, he escaped to Germany. He worked several years in Munich. Kept making films and directed theater and opera there. But that was it for a while for him in Sweden. He just abandoned everything. But he'd already moved pretty much his residence to Fårö in the north end of Gotland at that time. So anyway, that's the backstory there.
Yeah, I was just curious if that had something to do, because he had nervous breakdown and it wasn't easy on him, the accusations, of which he was acquitted, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately. So one of the people joining us today was wondering if we can have a list of these movies that you mentioned today. And I think it's easy for us to do so. We'll just type them all up, Sam, is that okay? And we'll send an email.
Before we even do that, I'll tell you the key Bergman films just to start out. He made some of the great classic art movies. He was making films up to 2003, I think was his last one, called Saraband. That's not where I want you to start. You should start with The Seventh Seal, this medieval masterpiece. Another medieval setting for a film by Bergman is 1960s The Virgin Spring, which is based on an old Swedish folk ballad. Actually, it's a great story, and it's one of my favorite Bergman films, even though he co-wrote the script. Usually, Bergman solo wrote is what he did, but on this one, he wrote the script with a female writer named Ulla Jakobsson. It turned out fine. It's a great film. Usually, though, he wasn't dealing with medieval ages, modern times. His films were very contemporary, and a lot of times they were about human interactions and how we can really be kind of cruel to each other and that sort of thing. So the human beast, you might say.
Nevertheless, we'll get those movies to you. Also, where do you think can we access some of these older black and white movies? What's a good source for those?
A lot of times Netflix or Prime will post some of them. Bergman comes up every so often, and there's probably one or two on one or the other of those streaming services. But if you want a guarantee to get almost every Bergman film, pay a visit to the Tower Theater. They have a very wide selection of DVDs, Blu-ray, and they have a lot of the Bergman films, if not all of the Bergman films. So it's the Tower Theater on 9th and 9th in Salt Lake City. Well, that's not Sugar House, it's 9th and 9th.
I mean,
Tower.
People here know when they say 9th and 9th, if somebody from outside comes to visit, it's a great little neighborhood, great cafes, and the Tower Theater, one of our local holdouts of small independent movie houses, right?
Well, I want to add to this. We're extremely fortunate in Salt Lake City as far as art houses go. There's a Salt Lake Film Society that runs the Tower Theater, but they also have taken on, I think there are 5 or 6 screens at the old Broadway cinemas downtown. And they run a very kind of hip, Sundance kind of oriented program down there. You can see a lot of the art films of today. Occasionally they'll run older art films, that sort of thing. And I highly recommend it. We're very fortunate in Salt Lake, actually, to have this. Usually a city of our size has one art house left. We have 7 screens, I think.
I think the arts have a very strong foothold here in Salt Lake. And I think it comes with being in Salt Lake, living in Salt Lake, that we have all these institutions, if you want. So we even have one movie theater close to downtown called Brewvies, where you can have a meal and your favorite ale. It's 21 and older only, but they're showing some independent films as well. And they're also a great little local, I don't know how to say, art place. So,
somehow, drinking and movies, I want to pay attention to the film, but other people might want to have a drink and a buzz, watch a movie. Anyway, it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah.
Get some movies out there.
Yeah, once we are allowed to do that again, great places to go to, the Tower Theater, 9th and 9th, and hopefully that will be soon. And same for us. Hopefully soon we get to travel again. For those who have joined us and don't know who we are, Go Learn is this faculty-led travel program from the University of Utah. So anyone far and near can join on a trip where a faculty or an expert of the U takes us on the road. We have Mimi Locker of the School of Architecture taking us to Japan every second year or so to talk about gardens and architecture and other things. We had another question. That the tax Nazis was a joke. Obviously, that wasn't referring to the real deal. A question came up.
I'm sure he thought they were tax Nazis.
He knew
Nazis. He lived in Germany before the war. He knew what they were. So, all right.
Happened to the Hanseatic League? Gene is asking.
Well, interesting. It's an extremely complex story. It is, and it sprawls, well, more than 300 years. There's still some remnants of the old Hanse, and there have been fairly recently some movement to create bits and pieces of the old Hanse, kind of a new Hanse kind of thing. Remember, Hanse means convoy in German. So it's basically trading, transporting products and selling them, that sort of thing. So humans, they want to do that. I mean, for sure. I mean, I want to do that. Everyone wants some money and, get wealthy and have products that you can consume, this sort of thing. So it's an extremely complex story that I can't get into all the details of it. Some cities would be part of the Hanse for a while and then leave it. There was a rise in nationalism during the Hanse era. So the Hanse, which wasn't really a state at all, it was a confederation of trading cities, sometimes would be competing against nascent nations, such as, well, the Netherlands, for instance. They went to war, with these burgeoning nations. I think Amsterdam, actually, Holland went to war against the Hanse League at one point. The whole issue with the Danish king, Valdemar Atterdag, in the late 14th century, is another part of this story. A lot of Danish cities had been Hansa cities, but then broke away, and with rising Danish nationalism, there were conflicts that led ultimately to Atterdag's invasion of Gotland and Visby. So it's very complex, and like most history, too complex really to summarize in a little nutshell here. Even Gotland, there were some Gotlanders who who were anti-Hansa and invited Atterdag to come in, and others, from especially the city of Visby, were very much against the invasion. Were very much aligned with the Hansa people there. So,
if I remember,
tough question.
Yeah, it's a tough question. It's multi-layered. From what I remember, being a tour guide in Europe, and every now and then having to talk about this, I took also people via Venice, through Venice, and it was also the rise and the power of the Venetian state that contributed to the weakening of the Hansa in the north. Plus, we had more and more Central European powerhouses like the Fuggers creating a financial web in Europe, much like it was the Medicis did in Italy. So the banking system, which was part of the Hansa strong, meaning not only goods, but also letters of deeds or things were traveling with them. All of this became then much more of a banking system. So several systems developed in that time, including, like I said, Venice being the powerhouse in the 16th century of trade to the south. And then the rise of nationalism. The Swedish king became a little bit too hungry for power. And so they stopped, slowly but surely, the Hansa city's power sort of weaned and left.
Again, as I said, Stockholm had really risen as a Hansa town through the trade. And that old part of Stockholm, Gamla stan, the old city, it's very close to the Hansa thing. But with the rise of nationalism and Sweden as a nation, especially in the 16th century, Gustav Vasa and other kings, was more unity, Swedish unity throughout that region, and a coalescence of power and control by the Swedes. And of course, that conflicted with the interest of the Hansa, who of course were German. Stockholm had its German district, okay, as did most of the Hansa cities.
That's right.
And even today, you find German names in Sweden a lot of times. In Copenhagen, for instance, I've got a very good friend in Copenhagen, Peter Wagner. Wagner's not a Danish name. In fact, his people came from Lübeck. He's related to the chocolate factory people in the city of Lübeck, very famous chocolate in Europe. And he's 100% Danish, but when it comes down to it, he's really German. It's really what it is. It goes back to the old days of German influence through the Hansa. It really was a German thing.
Right. Now, I need to say this as a German, when we talk of Germany, not until 1781 did we really exist as a nation state. 1871 did we exist as a nation. So when you say German, it's the different territories, the different what now is Germany.
Principalities, Christian.
Yeah, back then you would have had to say, oh, he's from this dukedom or from this kingdom. Quick question here. The surname Hansen, is that derived from Hansa?
No.
That's because that's
I would ask you right off, is it Hansen E or Hansen O?
Oh.
Okay. Swedish probably.
Okay.
Swedish probably. Son of Hans. Has nothing to do with convoys. Son of Hans. That's how they named people back in the day. You would be the son of so-and-so, and that would be your last name. Patronymic system is what they call it.
Another quick question we can have is, will the location where the Nobel Prize is given be part of the trip? Like when we are in June next year, if we're going, that should be the city hall, correct?
Yeah. First, when we're going.
Yeah.
When we're going. Okay.
We are going.
Now, the Nobel Prize. Of course, Nobel, inventor of dynamite, made a whole lot of money and established this fund and this prize. But the prize is actually several prizes, as you know. Now, the Peace Prize is actually awarded in, I believe, in Oslo. The main prize, though, for the Nobel is in the Stockholm City Hall, which is just a short walk from Gamla Stan. And we'll certainly visit that. It's Golden Hall is the main venue for that particular event of awarding the so-called Nobel Prize. I guess Bob Dylan got the prize for literature, right, a couple of years ago, and he didn't show up. Patti Smith came. That was held in the Golden Hall of Stockholm City Hall, which is a modern building, by the way. It's not from that era, but it's a fantastic structure, and we'll definitely pass by. Well, we won't just pass by, we'll tour it for sure.
On the list of movies that we're going to send them, one of the questions was, can you also refer some Danish films? Sorry.
Absolutely. All these I love, and I know a lot about them. My favorite Danish director of yore, his name is Carl Theodor Dreyer. He started out in the early silent era making movies. His great silent film is called The Passion of Joan of Arc. It was made in France, actually. One of the great silent films, period. But he made a lot of films in the silent era in Denmark. In the sound era, he made quite a few movies, and they're classics too. A vampire movie that rivals Nosferatu, the German film, is Dreyer's Vampyr. And it's very, very strange. It's the strangest of all the vampire movies. Day of Wrath comes a little later. It's about witch burnings. Boy, I mean, he went on and on. My favorite Dreyer film is from 1952. It's a film called Ordet, or The Word. It's after a play by a Danish playwright who was also a priest. His name was Kai Munk, and Munk was killed by the Nazis during the war. But anyway, Ordet, or The Word, is really my favorite of one of my favorite films of all time. I can't get into what it's about, but I highly recommend it. So Carl Theodor Dreyer, the Danish film industry is constantly active, especially the last 20 years or so. And a lot of the Danes have gone to Hollywood. Mads Mikkelsen, you see him in every other Hollywood movie these days. He's Hannibal on Netflix, one of the great actors, but there's all kinds of directors and technicians and actors that work in Hollywood kind of regularly, but they do their best work, I think, in Denmark. Lars von Trier is another contemporary Danish director. Excellent, very smart, a little bit on the edge. Mm-hmm. Got to have a little bit of a stomach to watch von Trier. So Antichrist, or oh gosh, what's the one about the end of the world from a few years ago with Claire Danes? Can't remember the title, but great film, great film.
We had one more specific question to Bergman and Swedish culture. Let me read it out for you. Bergman explores universal existential themes. Which themes, however, are specifically rooted in Swedish culture and society?
Well, one theme that runs throughout the entire Swedish cinema is the role of nature in human psychology. You see it in the early Swedish films of Victor Sjöström, and Bergman, certainly. When you watch a Bergman film, note the landscapes and the framing. There's a connection in a lot of Scandinavian film and Swedish film and director in particular of the connection of the individual human psyche and the world around us, especially nature. So watch for that when you're watching a Bergman film.
To speculate a little bit, because we are going on purpose at Midsummer to Sweden. And because the Swedes, and for most parts, most Northern Europeans, are very drawn into some of the things that you would call more pagan rituals. And that's one of them, celebrating the harvest. You know, you talked about the burial of a Viking, which is such a different concept than what we know now and how barbaric was all of that.
It's a great story.
It's a great story. But let me speculate that when we go to Sweden, we will kind of like delve into that of the pagan side of things, including how important nature really is to people. I'm not saying that's just a pagan thing, but I feel like that might be a remnant from the old days, and it is still very much on the Swedish psyche.
Well, there's a film I mentioned earlier, Bergman's The Virgin Spring. It's set at the time when Sweden, central Swedish area, was becoming Christianized. So we're talking the 10th century. And in the film, which I think says a whole lot more about the real paganism of the predecessors of the Christians in Scandinavia. Anyway, Bergman's film has a lot more fidelity to what really was in terms of paganism in those days, as opposed to, say, the recent film that came out, an American film, Midsommar, which is really just kind of a paraphrasing of the Hammer film from 1974, The Wicker Man. And it romanticizes the old pagan rites and, Midsummer and all this sort of thing. And I think that the Midsummer film from last year really takes that to the max. It doesn't really have much to do with the ancient Swedes or Vikings or any of that kind of thing. I mean, it's a yarn. Okay. And it's romanticized for sure. And it's shot in Hungary too, for goodness sake. Do that right off, watching the movie. This isn't Sweden. So anyway, we can get into that. I know a whole lot about the topic of paganism.
We are nearing the end of our hour. Actually, we are over 4 minutes. There's many still there in the room. So I want to thank everyone who joined us today. But most importantly, I want to join Sam for presenting just on these three interesting aspects of Sweden, if you want so, but also, of course, the Hanseatic League of Northern Europe. Thank you for the insight into your film encyclopedia, in your knowledge of films. And yes, we will share the list. That'll be something that we will do to everyone. And
I'll send you a list. Yep. Bergman made a lot of films.
We're passing that on. So thank you so much, Sam. This was so informative. Thanks to everyone out there, our alumni, anyone who joined us today. This was great.
Well, thanks everybody.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning in.